glad you're here this morning. I'm excited about this class, partly because I own this, Jack. I'm a nerd and I like nerd stuff. But this class will be at, you might say, a senior level high school course. But better because there's no assigned readings and there's no homework and there's no tests except by God. You don't bring any essays. I'm saying that because I've taught a version of this one time in a previous class church, but I've revamped about 50% of it. I'm excited about it. Just real quick background, and then we'll get started. I had ethics class, one or two in my undergraduate, one in my master's degree, and then one in my PhD. And so I've had a good bit about ethics and bioethics and so forth. And then I taught ethics at a high school for 2 years, one semester each time. It was so I taught that, and then I've taught on it in general. So all that to say, I have a thoroughly good introduction to morality and ethics. And what I have found is that most people in normal routines of life have never been exposed to thinking about morality. But we use it all the time, we talk about it all the time, and you can see by people on news channels, on all kinds of things, you can see they have never formally studied it versus a person who has formally studied it. And so I feel derelict as a senior pastor and as a discipleship person in general not to cover some topics, even if they're not very exciting for the person, like Revelation. That's why I cover Trinity. At least one time in your life, I want to cover, that's why I do Trinity studies or things on morality, so we're better at thinking about it. And that's why I'm doing it. Why I'm doing it is because there's an overwhelming ignorance about how to think about and talk about morality, and I think Christians ought to be pretty good about thinking about it. Pretty good about it, think about it. The second reason is because when we read our Bible, we come across multiple moral issues, and that's a common conundrum for a lot of people. Why does the Bible say this sounds unethical to me, or what do I do with that? So I'm going to give you some just overview principles of how to read the Bible better. I think that'll be helpful. The other thing I want to say very quickly is this is just an introduction. That's all this is. You might say it doesn't feel like it. I get it. I respect that. But it is an introduction. But it's a good one. It's a good overview of what morality is all about. But it is not in depth. If you want more of that, I'm happy to recommend literature to you. There's fantastic. So, okay, enough of that. Do you have your handout? We'll get started. I've done a little differently this time is I put a lot of notes on the screen, and you don't have to write all this down, but if you want to write notes, feel free to bring a handout. Bring a notepad with you. The handout's going to cover just an outline until we get to the last part of the study. But in general, just definitions, just real quick, the definitions. So the word ethics comes from Greek. I mean, ethique in French, of course, etiquette, we see that. It's from the Latin and ancient Greeks. It's ethike. That means moral philosophy, or ethos is something like character or disposition. That's what ethos is, ethics. And of course, from the Greek, went to the Latin, to the French, to English. So ethics has to do with character or disposition toward things. Okay, that's basically what it is. The reason we get the word morality comes from the Latin. That's from Middle English, from the Old French, morality, Latin from moralitas. And that same thing, go all the way back to manners or customs. Manners or customs. The term was popularized, of course, by Cicero, and that's how he translated it from the Latin to ethikos. The bottom line is morality and ethics mean roughly the same thing. They mean roughly the same thing. Sometimes you'll find people say, I've heard it both ways. I've heard people say morality is the study of all of the ethical systems. I've heard people say, no, ethics is the whole, I've heard it. So if you really want to nerd out, find your particular ethicist you like and follow their leads. In my view, I'm going to use them basically the same. If I had to pick one option, I typically say morality has to do with the broad big picture. And that's why I call this study morality, not ethics, but morality. When I use the word ethics, I tend to use that about particular ethical decisions. So you might say business ethics, or the ethics, the particular ethical choices at that business place. But it doesn't really matter, but I will be pretty specific. I'm pretty consistent with that. Morality is the big picture of right and wrong, good and bad. And that's what the study is an overview of how we come to those concepts of right and wrong, good and bad. And in general, that's the words. Okay, now again, the screen's full of my notes, and so you don't have to write this down. Some of you like to read along as I talk, and some you don't. That's fine too. And whatever. But I'm covering your outline that you should have right in front of you. I'm just unpacking it, okay? So, what is morality? This is called meta-ethics in the field. And that's a big concept. Meta-ethics is when we talk about what is right and wrong and how do we talk about right and wrong. It's meta-ethics is how we talk about right and wrong, morality. And so in general, philosophers have said there are about four major conditions that are necessary or at least sufficient to describe something as morality. These are four major things. And the first one is a judgment is moral only if it's accepted as supremely authoritative. Supremely authoritative. To unpack that, it overrides conduct, attitudes, and motives. So moral judgments are extremely important. They carry a great deal of authority. They override considerations of mere etiquette, custom, and law. It's supremely authoritative. And that's what someone said is a moral duty or moral value, which I'll talk a lot about here as the study progresses. But what is something a moral issue when it's supremely authoritative? It's more important than particular laws of a country. It's supreme above that. That is to say, we call something a moral decision if it's supremely authoritative. Two, a judgment is moral only if it is a prescriptive imperative that recommends actions, attitudes, and motives. And it's not merely a factual description about actions, attitudes, and motives. So, real pause there. That's really important, and I'll talk a lot about this. Something is moral not when it's describing what is, but it's prescribing. Think prescription of a medical physician. They prescribe something. You ought to take this medication. There's an oughtness, a shouldness to it. That's morality. It's not a description of the way it is, but the way it ought to be. This is not the same as an aesthetic ought, like one ought to paint this way to make the picture more beautiful. We use that vocabulary. You ought to stay in the lines or whatever. That's not a moral ought. You've not sinned if you color outside the lines. Some parents need to hear that one more time. Your kids haven't sinned. But we say, in general, humans have accepted that you ought to stay and not mix all the colors in one blob. In general, you ought to. That's not morality, though we use that word ought. It's not that. It's also not a rational ought. You ought to believe me based on the evidence. You ought to move your rook to the knight to win in chess. We say ought there, or you should. You should get up early to get on time to the job. That's not a moral ought, or should, but we're saying that vocabulary. That's not morality. So in morality, we're talking about something prescriptive over behavior. You ought to do this because it's a moral issue. It's supremely authoritative. There's an oughtness, a shouldness, not a factual. Three, a judgment is moral only if it is universalizable. That is to say, if it applies equally to all relevant, similar situations, regardless of your race, your background, your socioeconomic level. For example, if one act of lying is wrong in that particular situation, right, then outside of those relevant situations, it's always wrong. It's always wrong. All the time. If it's wrong in this situation, did you take the candy? And you know you did, and you go, no, you lied. Well, if I'm Chinese and I took the candy, is it wrong? You lied. You can't do that. Or if I'm Mexican. In other words, it doesn't matter what part of the world you're in. If you stole the candy and you said something wasn't true, you lied. That's wrong. And so it's universalizable. There you go. So that's another thing. It's a moral thing. It's not, well, that's what you think. No, something is moral when it applies to all people in that same situation. A judgment is moral only if it makes reference to proper human flourishing, and that's the goal. It's about humans. Human dignity, the welfare of others, the prevention of harm, the provision of benefit. So the point is, morality doesn't apply to other things and other beings. When a lion forcefully copulates a lioness, the lion didn't rape the lioness, as William Craig says all the time, Bill Craig. He didn't rape it. When a whale eats tiny minnow fish, it didn't murder the fish. When the gorillas fight the other gorillas and there's a war and they beat the gorillas, the gorillas didn't murder the other gorillas because they're animals. Morality only applies to that which is human. And that's one of the main reasons why people who fight for animal rights try to make sure they get the same rights as humans, like dolphins. If you can put them in the same category as a human person, then I am morally obligated, and therefore also typically legally obligated, not to do inhumane. That is, we can't treat them as if they're not human. In the Christian worldview, that's silly. They are not human. I don't need to treat animals like they're human because they're not human. But if you're not a Christian, then we're just evolved chimps. That makes sense, I guess. You start making random functional arguments. Well, they're super smart. Well, they have red hair. You got to be nice to them. But most people concur for something to be moral, it applies to humans and humans only. That's really important to understand. Dogs don't rape dogs. They just forcefully copulate. They don't rape them. If I walked down the street and did what my dog would do to a dog, I'd go to jail. And worse than that, I would have sinned. I've done something immoral. And you would say, why did he do that? If a dog does it, they go, they're just being dogs. And you say, that's right, but men are dogs. Well, that's another lesson. So close your mouth. So, again, for the most part, morality, I like how Bill Craig says it this way. This is right. For the most part, morality is supremely authoritative, prescriptive, universalizable, and make reference to human welfare, dignity, and flourishing. That's what morality is all about. So as we go forward, we'll talk about moral values and duties, but in general, that's what we mean by the word moral. Any questions about anything I've said so far? Anything at all? The four that are bold and yellow, so supremely authoritative, those are the biggest. Supremely authoritative, they're prescriptive, they're universalizable, and they're about human flourishing. Those are the big four. And most ethicists would concur with that, and I sure do. I think this fits really well. That is, this is what. So if you don't have these four things, you're not talking about a moral ought. You might be talking about, well, you're not talking about a moral ought. You probably, maybe it's a custom. We'll talk about that here, maybe today or tomorrow, I mean next week or whatever. But you might be talking about a custom, and I'll talk about this again. It's okay to repeat myself, but in the West, or at least in America, we drive on the right side of the road. Well, it's not universalizable, right? It's supremely authoritative over ways to drive, but that's it. It is prescriptive, but it doesn't apply to all people at all times, no matter how they drive. And it's kind of about human flourishing, but more that's just a custom, so that's not a moral issue. If I drove on the left side, it's silly, it's destructive, you're going to get in a car wreck, but you've not done something immoral. You say, well, David, the law is, now we've changed the subject. Is it illegal or legal, or moral or immoral to disobey the government? That's another issue. But I mean, you could put anything you want to of an ought or a should. Good question. So those are the four major features. Supremely authoritative. Anybody have a question? Comments? Yes, sir, Joe? Are the slides on the website? No, but I can give them to you if you want. If you want. Again, the main things you might say are on the outline that I gave to you, but as far as fill in the blank, I figured to help you fill in. But yeah, I'm happy to send you what you want. Any other questions about that? When I talk about a moral judgment, these are the four major features. Anything else? Did you get your outline? Handout? Dustin? Right there, the table, if you want to get it. Any other questions? Okay. No questions? Feel free to. This is a safe place. If you're with me so far, you might say, David, this is so abstract. I get it. It is. It'll get more and more, relatable as the study progresses. We start at the meta-ethic, the biggest abstract part, and we get more and more, oh, now I know the words he's using. Okay, well. So here's another major feature about thinking about morality, and that is what we call objectivism, that's realism, versus subjectivism or relativism. And this is asking the question, to what do moral values refer? To what do moral values refer? So if I'm a realist, I believe in realism. Oh, hold on, back up. Oh, I don't have a slide for that. Do I? That one, there we go, there we go. Okay, good, we'll go back to that. So here's realism. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I skipped over B. That's the point. Okay. Sorry. Okay. All right. So this reiterates this, but make sure you understand this. The descriptive, the fact versus prescriptive. In general, a fact or factual belief involves a description about the way the world is, right? It's a common sense, just the way the world is. But in contrast, a moral value involves the adherence to some moral proposition that prescribes what morally ought to be. And ought always makes a prescription. Always, always, always. Moral prescriptive statements are statements of morality. For example, rape is wrong, or rape is morally permissible, or one should not rape. Thus, morality is not a description of what is, but what ought to be. Now, I'll talk more about this later on too, and that's the way it has to be. Morality isn't a part of nature. It is not part of nature. It's not part of what is. We have to be real clear about that when we think about morality. We're not talking about the way thing is, but the way it should be, which morality always assumes that we know where it should be. I'll just say it this way. If you talk to a normal person on the street and you say, is the world the way it ought to be? The average person is going to say, no. There's something in it that says no. What's wrong with it? Well, if they're honest, they're going to say, me. If they're honest, but they won't be. I'm what's wrong with the world, and all humans are. But if I say, wait, so it's not the way it should be? How should it be? And if they're honest, thinker type, whatever they're going to say, it should be nicer and kinder, and when people don't do hurt each other, and they don't lie to each other. And, where did that come from? Now, that's where C.S. Lewis would go the route. This moral law designs a moral lawgiver. It implies a moral lawgiver. And that's not the purpose of this study. The point is we all just know it shouldn't be this way. It should be something else. That's terms of morality. If I go into the forest, and I love the forest as a Boy Scout for years, and there are limbs down and trees down, and when we go to Tennessee and we see bears wandering in leaves the forest, at no point does a normal, rational person walk around and go, those trees should be erect. That limb shouldn't be there on that rock. That rock should be formed this way. Nobody does that because they're not crazy. They go, it's nature. It's just nature. Trees don't obey moral laws. They obey laws of physics. It fell down because of gravity and the squirrel and the lightning hit it, but no one's going, oh, I can't believe that limb. It's so offensive. It fell in the path. It shouldn't do that. I mean, you would laugh if someone said that. That's dumb. And that's good that it's dumb because it's silly. You should laugh, oh, you're being silly. But if they were serious, you go, well, that's not how morality works. This limb is not obeying the moral law. When we talk about morality, we're talking about the way it should be, where it should be, not the way it is. We'll come back later on. Okay, any questions on that? That's very important. That's the basis of that. Okay. Now we're asking, well, what do the moral values refer? So in realism or objectivism, let's think about that for a second. If you're a realist or an objectivist, you think about truth like this. Realists maintain that there are objective truths that exist independently of human beliefs, perceptions, or feelings. Independent. These truths are, you might say, out there in the world, and our beliefs can correspond to or fail to correspond to them. Let me pause here for a second. That is so important. A realist or objectivist, as you might already gather, I am, and I would argue all Christians should be. You should clean your room. That's a moral ought right there, Julia. Sorry. Objective doesn't mean everybody does it. It means it's independent of us. We appeal to it. It is objective. It doesn't mean everyone agrees with it, everyone does it, but everyone assumes it. If I went to any part of the world whatsoever, and I go to their train or subway, and I walk by and I step on everyone's foot, there's no culture on the planet they're going to go, oh well. They're going to strike them as unfair. What if I get in front of the line all the way they go? Then they assume that I'm appealing to something outside of myself, regardless of my culture, the color of my skin, or education, says you shouldn't do that. A realist or objectivist says there's something out there to which we're all appealing, which means you either get it or you don't. You either appeal to it and you understand it, or you don't get it. And people say this about mathematics. and a realist says mathematical truths are real. They're not a thing, but they're real, and you're appealing. 2 plus 2 equals 4. You either get it or you don't. But if you don't get it, no, it's up to me. It's my truth. No, it doesn't work that way. Now, some people can't grasp math. They're called dyscalculia, right? They have dyscalculia. It's hard for them to grasp mathematical concepts. It's a psychological thing, they're a neurological thing they can't grasp. So dyscalculia doesn't mean mathematics is a free-for-all. It just means there's something wrong with you. Your radio doesn't work. But the rest of us humans understand 2 plus 2 does go 4. It just is the way it is. And if you say it's 5, you're just wrong. You're mistaken. Well, that's how it is about a realist in general. A moral realist, instead of doing mathematics, a moral realist believes that moral values are abstract properties. They're objective in the same sense that geometrical or mathematical properties might be thought to be objective. That's it. They exist, whether you like them or not, whether you agree with them or not, regardless of your education, money you make. They're either objective because they're based on some absolute standard. We call this Platonism. They just like floating objects. That's Platonism. For instance, if a moral realist says torturing innocent beings is wrong, they're claiming that this statement reflects on absolute moral fact, independent of human opinions. So they're either based on an absolute standard or they're just out there floating. That's really it, which we'll talk about later on. And that's it. That's it. And so Christians will say absolute standard is God, or they're just out there like 2 plus 2 equals 4, and it's floating in some floating, the very word. But either way, both agree they exist. They're real. They're real. And if you don't get it, you're mistaken. So a realist would say torturing innocent beings is wrong. It's reflecting a real moral fact of reality, regardless of what you think. Okay, so a moral realist would say, let's say the Nazis won and they took over all of Europe, and let's just say they stopped there. To this very day, the 1,000-year Reich or whatever still going on, and they're still teaching that Jews aren't fully human, they're rodents, and all their normal, sorry, but stupid nonsense. And they say, yeah, but millions and millions and millions of people believe that's true. A moral realist would say, and they're still wrong. If everybody in the world came to believe that they're not fully human and we should exterminate Jews, a moral realist would say they're still wrong. It doesn't matter. We don't take a vote. It's still out there. It just means everyone's wrong. Everyone's mistaken. A subjectivist would say, no, they're not, which we'll talk about in a second, because they feel it. They just know it, and they've made a vote or whatever. A moral realist said they're just wrong. It's out there beyond us. And that's it. The epistemology is, how do we come to know this? A realist believe, how do we know this? It's possible to have knowledge of the objective world, and this knowledge can be true or false based on how well it corresponds to reality. So we trust our gut. We trust the sense that says, I'm telling you something, I just know that I know that I know 2 plus 2 equals 4. I know if you add up the angles of 90-degree angles, you're going to get all these, a triangle. I can do geometry. It's just true. I didn't do a scientific experiment. I just know it. I just know that raping babies is wrong. I don't care what you think. I don't care how you were raised. It's just wrong. I'm appealing to something outside of me. We call those people moral realists. Subjectivism, of course, is different. Subjectivism, they say about truth, that truth is contingent upon individual or collective beliefs, perception, or feelings. It's contingent. It doesn't have to be that way. So a statement is true if it coheres with a person's or group's beliefs or feelings, and there's no external or objective reality to which beliefs must correspond. Now, I'm going to do this on purpose because we're at a church, and I'm not trying to persuade you. I'm going to assume some things. But does this sound like any kind of nation you know of? Huh? As long as the group feels this way or thinks this way, then that's true. Right? That's the definition of relativism or subjectivism. And this is it is the number one competing moral philosophy in America, in the Western world, for sure. That's it. As long as it coheres the person's beliefs or feelings, then it's moral. I should cut off my breast if it feels like this, or I should have sex when I want to. I should cuss. I should get drunk. I should, whatever the think should is, because I feel like it. Or my community thinks that. My tribe believes that. My neighborhood believes that. My people group believe that. And that's what makes it moral. That's a subjectivist or a relativist. So that's about truth. Moral subjectivism is what I just said. They think that moral judgments are based on individual collective preferences. So truth is that way, which means morality has to be that way. So when a subjectivist says stealing is wrong, they mean something like, I disapprove of stealing, or my culture disapproves of stealing. Not that it's wrong. Out there it's wrong, but rather we don't do that. We don't prefer that. We don't like that. And if you ask a subjectivist, why don't you want it? They might go, that's just what my culture believes, my tribe. Well, why not? Is it bad or good? Well, I mean, it's bad. What do you mean by bad? It means we don't like it. But why don't you like it? We just agreed that it's not what we want. We just came together like at our neighborhood meeting, or it means it's just the way we feel strongly about it. It's not because it's wrong because we've broken some universal rule. It just means we just don't feel like it. And so that's why for a relativist or subjectivist, technically speaking, they really, really, really love tribes and clans and groups. It's really important for a relativist, of which most Americans are, to find their club. That's exactly why pedophiles hang out together. That's why there's online groups for pedophiles and rapists and gangsters and non-binary, triple, sexual, blah, blah, blah. They have to find your club and your group. Alcoholics hang out together. Meth addicts hang out together. Everybody hangs out their clubs. So as soon as you get around this person, you feel emboldened because now I'm part of a whole group and there's power in numbers. We all believe strongly that it's just minor person attractiveness. There's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing wrong at all. And we all agree that how could it be wrong? We all agree. And that's exactly how the tribe, that's one of the major reasons why people in our culture love, I'm convinced of it. Epistemology, how do they know this? For subjectivists, knowledge is personal or culturally constructed. What's true in one culture to one person might not be considered true in another culture to another person, period. So if you're subjectivist, you can't say that Hitler was wrong. You can't say the Nazis were wrong. You'd say, well, I wouldn't do it. I've seen interviews, I've asked people, I've asked relativists, so was it wrong for the Nazis to do that? They go, well, I wouldn't say it. I wouldn't do that. Why not? Well, I mean, I don't do it that way, but I can't tell them. I've heard street interviews with people today. Was it wrong to murder all the babies and smash them against the wagon so they could stop crying? I mean, I wouldn't do it. But is it wrong? Well, I can't tell them that. Can you imagine what would have happened if that were the dominant view like it is today? You know, the 1940s when all of our young men said, I'm going to go defend these people. Well, I mean, who am I? I mean, I see the ads before the movies, but I mean, come on. Hey, teach their own. I don't live there. That's what relativists do. Relativism, subjectivism, I found like I'm making fun of it. I'm not really I'm making fun of the idea, not the people. I think the idea is dangerously dumb, but I do. I think the idea is, I do. So I'm just being forthright with you. I think it's, anyway, I got to move on. Okay. Any question about that? You say, David, I was a subjectivist. You said we're all dumb. I don't think you're all dumb. Maybe I should wait till my commentary. Any questions about realism versus subjectivism or objectivism? And Julie, what about school? Do you hear this in school a lot? Mm-hmm. She said, oh, yeah, I'm online. She said, oh, yeah, constantly. You're supposed to go with what they say. Because they have a group. Right, right. You're the minority. And when the whole tribe says it, what are you going to do? Because, yeah, that's right. The tribe is wrong. That's right. But it's true. That's right. Tribes become bullies, right? They become mobs. That's why they try to crucify them, right? It takes. Mm-hmm. You face it all the time, yeah. Yeah, their whole belief system. Yeah. And that's why these groups, of course, to them, I'm convinced, the number one sin, of course, is judgment. Because in the tribe, you can't, judging a person, and more relativism and subjectivism, assumes you are above them, which they said, that's not the rule. I'm a subjectivist. I'm a relativist. No one is above me. We're all equal in the tribe. So you have no moral authority to tell me I've done something wrong. You're just in the wrong club. Go find that club. You don't agree with killing Jews? Don't come be a Nazi. That's fine. Go do your thing over there in America. That's fine. But over here, we exterminate them. You don't have any right to tell me I'm wrong. What is wrong with you? You broke the cardinal rule of subjectivism. You're attempting to judge me. Well, take out Nazis and add anybody you want to in America. I mean, that's right. You have to join. Who do you think you are? Yeah, realists like myself fundamentally disagree. That doesn't mean we go out our way to tell them they're wrong. No. I'm not talking about judging people. I'm just saying we do, as Julia said, as we say in our home all the time, we simply do disagree. So when someone says, that's what I just, my culture, my club, I go, okay. I mean, okay. I do fundamentally disagree with you. I think morality is real. It really exists. It's a real feature of reality. And if you say something like is wrong, killing babies is wrong, I think it is wrong, regardless of your feelings or not. So much so, if you disagree with these statements, my view is that there's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with you, not morality, but you. That there are certain things are just wrong. That's what makes it objective. They say, well, it's not objective. I disagree with you. For the history of humanity and every piece of literature we've ever had, ever, in general, all humans, in general, 99.9% of humans agree that there's a thing called the moral law. We all are appealing to it. Well, David, they're different. We're going to talk about that. We will. But in all that to say, I think moral realism is by far the most commonsensical. But not everyone thinks that. That's fine. Any question about that? I'm done preaching for a second. You're doing great. Or your silence means you're never coming back, and you don't want to leave right now because you're sad and embarrassed. Feel free to run out if you want. Is this too fast? Really? Do I need to repeat anything? Cool, easy peasy. Well, good for us. All right, let me talk a little bit about moral values versus social etiquette versus law. Okay, so moral values versus social etiquette, the way I would say expressing the moral values versus law. So let me make this is a biggie. This shows up in my conversations with students when I was a high school teacher, but normal people all the time. Cultures, people groups, right, can choose to care about certain things that aren't moral at all. Cultures can do all day long, like preferred verbal expressions. In the South, we say y'all because you're Christians, y'all don't. There's just verbal expressions that are preferred. It's not immoral. Well, it may be pretty immoral not to say y'all. That may be a bad example. But all right, so y'all say both and eggs and spigot. No, what's the other one you say? So they're verbal expressions. Northern, you guys, fine. That's not moral. Who cares? What's your favorite preferred food or drink? In North Carolina, their barbecue is always pork. They put coleslaw on top of it, and you have to say, I don't want coleslaw or pickles. And then in Texas, it doesn't. There's just food preference drinks, sweet tea versus unsweet tea, driving rules. It's just in the South. Well, in America, we do the right side versus the left side. Or in the South, whenever you pass someone, almost invariably, you got to wave at them. They wave at you. You're friends to everybody. Not here. You give them the bird. It's just weird. It's cultures. I'm kidding. Cultures just that's not moral, right? So that's what we may call just normal cultural things that are amoral. Put an A in front of moral. Amoral. They're not moral. They're not immoral. They're just neutral. Whether I use a pen or a pencil is not a moral issue. But you chose, right? But the choice was not moral. It was an amoral. I just want a pen. It's not moral. It's amoral. Cultures do that all the time. Great. So whether Asian, Canadian, European, American, there's tons of things that express. Okay. Then there's something else we call etiquette from the French, of course. That refers to the customary, polite way to behave in social situations. Now, these conventions are the unwritten rules that dictate how the considerate of others, how you're considerate, how to behave in certain situations. Cultures can care about certain etiquette that do express moral values. For example, and this people get this, well, I'll tell you in a second. For example, in America, most Americans, regardless of where you're from, if you want to show honor to a person when you meet them, what do you do? Or respect to a person, what do you do? Usually, you shake their hand. That's a typical, right? Okay, I can't see y'all. That quiet makes me. So all the point is, normal people would shake their hand. Now, strict Jews don't touch female, male, and Muslim. I get it. But in general, you would greet a person and shake their hand. But in Asian cultures, you do not do that. What do? You bow. So, but in both cultures, That's etiquette in different cultures, but both cultures are attempting to express a moral value that they value, and that is showing honor or respect. There's different things. For example, in the South, you always call people sir or ma'am if they're older than you. In Africa, it's the same way. If you're even 1 year older, you call them uncle or auntie, or you call them sir, man. You don't ever. It is extremely disrespectful not to call someone sir or ma'am. In the South, you say please and thank you. You call people by their titles. If they're doctor, you call them doctor. If you're 80 years old or 8 years old. But they're trying to express respect or honor. In the North, it's different. The point is, we have different ways of expressing that etiquette. That's the way we're expressing our values. What people typically get wrong is this. People typically think the way I'm expressing it means they're different moral values. So they go different cultures and go, their values are radically different to America. You go, but are they really? What are they trying to express? What's the moral value they're attempting to express? And you'll find over and over and over and over they're identical, with rare exception. With rare exception, they have the same. Every culture tries to express respect and honor to a person. They just do it in different ways. No more than Jack in America. There's just different ways of expressing it. So some things cultures do have nothing to do with morality, food and preference, drink preference. Sometimes they do have to do with morality, and that's etiquette. How do I express to you that I'm polite and kind and X, Y, Z? And so that can be different. But they're expressed different ways. So what? So when I go to different cultures today, if women, if you went to Israel, right, they're going to say, if you go to any kind of city or sacred site for sure, you're going to have to have a skirt on or cover your arms up, particularly for Muslims, because they're trying to express modesty or respect for the situation. But here, no, I mean, girls don't walk around, you don't know, most churches, right, you don't walk around and all covered up. But you're trying to, but most people, if you're thoughtful Christian at all, you're not going to go, no, they're my legs. It's so oppressive. You might go, I want to demonstrate respect because I care about that moral value, and that's how they interpret it. So I'll put on a skirt. Yeah. Etiquette can shift over time. Yes, it can. The moral values haven't, but how they express it. That's correct. That's exactly right. Yeah, fist pumps and all that stuff. Yeah, especially because of COVID. Thanks, COVID. That's right. Now, laws and our governments work the exact same way. Some things aren't moral; they're just amoral. Which side of the road we drive on? Well, at some point, you got to decide. Or people will run into each other all the time. Imagine the chaos would ensue. Just pick a side. Well, that's Egypt. When I was there, just it doesn't matter. Oh goodness, your heart rate. You can't close your eyes. But that's not moral. It's just you got to pick one so we survive. Some legislation is based on morality, like not murdering, not stealing. Stealing means you're disrespecting someone else's personal property. That's a basic moral value. What we call the preservation of human life, not murdering. So some of it is. So when someone says, you can't legislate, I used to say this, and I heard it when I was a kid, you can't legislate morality. And so I started thinking about laws. I go, yeah, you can. You do it all the time. Yes, we do. Most of the laws in our books, a significant portion of the laws we have in every culture are trying to prohibit or promote various moral values. We do it all the time. Abortion. Not everything is a moral issue, but some things very much are. So it's silly to say you can't legislate morality. Yeah, you can, or at least enforce it. That's why the whole thing about being created equal and pursuit of happiness, these are basic assumptions. I'm going to pause there and say about on this particular issue. Any question or comments about this so far? The distinction I'm making between moral values and social etiquette and the law. Please. Good question. So what if there are laws or portion of laws that go against your moral values? My view is in Christian worldview is you always disobey any rule placed upon you that is a sin. That's because, in my view, the chief authority of Jesus, as you know, I'm just saying for everybody, and then the early church's teachings. So if there's any law by a government that tells me not to do what a Christian's supposed to do, to prohibit it, or to encourage behavior that Jesus says don't do, the government loses every time. Because the government is another word for a bunch of people who rule over me. And people don't decide, they're not my authority, Jesus is. So if that means I have to be punished according to the government's laws because I disobey them, so be it. Because I agree, as being an American citizen, that I'm obeying their rules, if and until. But it also means I also respect their authority to punish me if I don't obey their laws. That's why I'm in America. If I disagree with that, I'd go somewhere else, to another country. But I go, yeah, they put me in jail. I like everything else about America except the rule that I have to kill every third baby I have. No, I'm not living in America anymore. Or I'll be in prison the rest of my life, or whatever it might be if I'm just making up a rule. Any other question about that? So it's scary that certain churches are, uh, I'm trying to paraphrase, go away from Scripture as the ultimate truth, and they become relativist. Absolutely, I completely concur. They disagree with us and go, no, 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 no. We live in a culture and a time now. We have to catch up with the times. We have to, from an ethicist or a moral specialist, now that you're becoming one, and maybe you already were, but now that you know this, you would say is, we're not drifting, we're not evolving. All you're talking about is you're what's called a subjectivist or a relativist. I'm an objectivist or a realist. We're not sliding in anything. You've chosen a camp. You've chosen a way to understand morality, and we fundamentally disagree. There's no middle ground between these two. So it's a choice. Either you're that or you're this. You're not evolving, you're not going with the times. You're simply a subjectivist, and they've been around for a long time. It just means you bought in the camp. The soundbite from your side is that we're evolving, we're progressive, we're moving along with the times. That's the soundbite. But in scholarship, that's silly nonsense. You're just as old as pagan is. That's the Romans did the same, the Greeks did the same thing. It's just, that's your camp. That's fine. Just own it. Just say, oh, no, I'm a relativist. But the fact is, no one is. No one is. If I said, no one is, in reality, they're not. As soon as you say, hey, I want to steal all your stuff. No, you're not. Why not? Because it's wrong. Well, wait a second. My tribe says it's good to take your stuff. No one's a real subjectivist. They are on paper, they are online, but in the real world, no one is that I know. If they are, they're called a psychopath. I'm kidding. I'm just a joke. Yeah, I do also think it's a shame that, yeah. Well, this last thing, and we're up out of time for today, and we'll come back. If you have more questions, we'll do this. So, how do we learn what is good? Good question. I know you were thinking that. This is called moral epistemology. Moral epistemology. How do we know? So we were just talking about to what do moral values refer. Now we're talking about how do we know? That's what epistemology. Well, basically it's two things. We're either taught it or we learn it. I mean, that's it. We're either taught moral values and duties or we discover them. We apprehend them, as we call it. Just like we do in mathematics. All right. I learned my multiplication tables because a teacher made me do it. But if I were smart enough and reflected for a long time, I could have come up with the exact same chart. You could have too. I wasn't intelligent as a fourth and fifth grader to think of math multiplication. I just had to learn it and trust the authority figures in my life to say this was true and not false. But as I learned them, I realized this is true. Because for fun, I used to go, what is 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4? It is 4 times 4. It equals, well, how about that? It's the truth. I didn't go, who are you? I used to teach my students, go to your math teachers and go, who are you to tell me what 2 plus 2 equals? And see what they say. Nobody does that. They assume if I were taught it or if I apprehended it, it's just true. That's how I learn moral values too. Somebody teaches me do not lie, it's wrong to lie, or I apprehend it as I grow up and go, you know what, that just feels wrong. Something tells me I shouldn't be killing babies for fun. That seems wrong. I had a friend, a colleague, who had sex with his girlfriend before marriage, and he was an atheist. He didn't want to grow up nothing. He said, I felt this terrible guilt. And I'm like, ugh, where does this come from? That's what started his journey to become a Christian.